Kia ora, good morning everyone, Rich Wong here, welcome back to the channel. The lens we are looking at today is the 7Artisans AF 135mm f1.8 Max. It is a short telephoto prime lens with autofocus and a really fast f1.8 maximum aperture. A fast 135mm lens is great for portraits because it allows you to capture beautiful portrait photos from a slightly longer distance while also giving you a very shallow depth of field. This lens was first released for Nikon Z a few months ago, but there are also Sony E mount and Leica L mount versions available. 7Artisans has sent me an L mount sample for this review, so in this video I'm going to show you all my test results, some real-world photos, and my thoughts on this autofocus L mount lens from 7Artisans. Let's first have a look at the constructions and design of this 7Artisans lens. Apart from the lens hood and the lens cap, the body of this lens is pretty much completely made of metal. It feels very solid and well built. The weight is just over 1 kg, so this is definitely not a small or lightweight lens at all. But then again, a 135mm f1.8 lens is never going to be a small or lightweight lens. I put it next to the Realchox 135mm f1.8 lab, and the 7Artisans is a bit smaller and also quite a bit lighter. Mounted on my Lumix S5 II, the balance actually feels quite alright, but when mounted on the Lumix S9, it definitely feels quite front heavy. The front filter thread is 82mm. There is a large focus ring, which feels very smooth. When mounted on my S5 II, I cannot customize that focus ring for other controls while the lens is in autofocus mode. There are also two customizable buttons, but because L mount camera only allows one user custom button on the lens, so both buttons can only be used for the same control. There is a large AF/MF switch which feels nice and solid when you flick it. There is also an aperture ring with 3 clicks per stop. There is also an A position for those who prefer controlling the aperture from the camera body instead. Unfortunately, there is no extra resistance when you go from f16 to A, so it is quite easy to accidentally turn past f16 into A if you are not careful. But on the other hand, the clicks themselves feel great. Very satisfying when turning the aperture ring. To update the firmware, you use the USB-C port on the lens mount. There is also a rubber gasket on the metal lens mount to provide some weather protection. Overall, I'm pretty happy with the construction and build quality of this lens, but there are two things I feel could be improved. First is the lens cap. There's nothing actually wrong with it, but the logo is simply printed using a generic looking font instead of the official logo, which makes it look a bit cheap. If this is a cheap $99 lens, I won't care too much. But for a lens that costs almost $700, I feel 7Artisans could have done a slightly better job. Second is the lens hood. I find it is a bit hard to put it on and remove because it feels too tight. Hopefully it will loosen up a bit after more use. But at least it's better for it to be slightly tight than too loose. Let's have a look at the image quality now. The camera I used to test this lens is the Lumix S5 II. Starting with image sharpness at the maximum aperture f1.8, sharpness is already very good at both center and the corners. Stopping down to f2.8 improves the sharpness slightly, but I really don't think anyone would complain about the sharpness even at f1.8. Image sharpness remains excellent from f2.8 all the way to around f8. After that, diffraction starts to soften the image slightly. The minimum focus distance is 0.68 meter or 2.2 feet, which is very good for a 135mm lens. From my own measurements, the maximum magnification is around 0.28 times. You can easily take portrait photos with the face filling the frame. Images shot at the minimum focus distance at f1.8 are slightly soft, but actually perfect for portraits. If you want better sharpness, stopping down to around f4 gives you excellent sharpness. Bokeh is super important for a 135mm f1.8 lens. Most people buy a lens like this to shoot portraits with a dreamy look. This is one of the very few types of lenses where you can shoot a full body portrait and still completely melt the background to create that very special ultra shadow depth field look. There can be a bit of cat's eye effect around the corners when shooting at f1.8. You can reduce the cat's eye bokeh by stopping the lens down a little bit. The bokeh also remains nice and round even when you stop down the lens slightly. There's not much outline around the edges of the bokeh balls, and they also look very smooth. Overall, the bokeh looks very pleasing to my eyes. So, as long as you don't mind a little bit of cat's eye bokeh around the edges, I think most people will be very happy with the bokeh from this lens. If you enable vignetting correction, the lens has almost no noticeable vignetting even at the maximum aperture. However, I did notice a bit of negative vignetting when shooting at smaller apertures, which suggests the lens profile may be slightly overcorrecting the vignetting. If you disable vignetting correction, then there is some noticeable vignetting at f1.8. You need to stop down to around f4 before the vignetting becomes much better. I remember many years ago when I still shooting with DSLR cameras with my Nikon 135mm f2DC, one of my favorite lenses. It had beautiful rendering, but also crazy chromatic aberration. So I was a bit worried this lens might suffer from similar issues, especially considering its very affordable price tag. I thought this might be the weakness of this lens. But fortunately, chromatic aberration control is actually very good. There were some photos where I fully expected to see a lot of color fringing, but when I got home and checked the images on my computer, I was surprised to see almost no color fringing at all. My local test photos also show very minimal amount of color fringing. It is actually very impressive. Short telephoto lenses usually do not have much distortion, and not surprisingly, this 7Artisans lens also has very little distortion. It also doesn't really matter whether distortion correction is enabled or disabled because there is no noticeable distortion either way. Lens flare control is okay overall. While I usually do not run into any serious lens flare issues, when pointing the lens directly towards a bright light source, there can be some noticeable lens flare. With the 12 braid aperture design, this 7Artisans lens can render 12 points Sunstars. You need to stop the lens down to at least around f8 before the Sunstars become sharp and you start to see the long tails clearly. This lens uses STM motor for autofocus. Autofocus is pretty quiet, but autofocus speed is not really that fast and sometimes would hunt a bit before it can lock on the target. For portrait photos or shooting static scenes, it should not be a problem at all. I also did a bit of street photography with it at night with acceptable results. On a related topic, the aperture is a bit noisy. If you take photo with a small aperture setting, you would hear the aperture noise. If you shoot at f1.8, then you don't really hear the aperture noise. Video continuous autofocus works quite well. I shot this test video in f1.8, so pretty shallow depth of field. The focus tracks me reasonably well and the tracking is pretty smooth and fast enough. As long as your subject doesn't move too fast, continuous autofocus works pretty well. Focus breathing is noticeable. When I do my focus breathing test, I can see the change in field of view quite easily. When 7Artisans first told me about this lens, I was quite surprised. An autofocus 135mm f1.8 lens is technically very difficult to create because it is demanding in so many different ways. So have they met my expectations, and is this a lens I would recommend? If you shoot sports or anything that requires very fast autofocus, then I probably would not recommend this lens to you. At least not the L-mount version with the firmware I'm using right now. But if you mainly shoot portraits or anything that does not require extremely fast autofocus, then this 7Artisans 135mm f1.8 max could actually be quite a good choice. This lens can create photos with an ultra shallow depth of field that really separates your subject from everything else. You can very easily melt the background into beautiful smooth bokeh. Image quality is also quite good overall, with decent sharpness and excellent chromatic aberration control. Yes, there are a few areas that could be improved, such as the lens flare performance, but when you consider the price, under $700 for an autofocus 135mm f1.8 lens, I think this lens offers pretty good value for money. And if 7Artisans can further improve the autofocus performance with future firmware updates, then this lens would become even more impressive. It is really great to see more and more L-mount autofocus lens options in the market. If the response from users is good for this lens, we will see even more autofocus L-mount lenses from 7Artisans in the future.